Thank you very much to the Middle East Institute for giving me this opportunity, and to Ambassador Bodine for including me in a group of very distinguished and expert panelists. It seems to be a very useful moment to take stock of U.S. policy toward Iran, not simply because the conference is timed so nicely at the very midterm point of the Obama administration's first and/or final term, not simply because of the fact that we've now seen just about a year of each portion of the Obama administration's dual-track policy toward Iran, but also because it appears that we may be on the verge of another round of dialogue between the Iranians and the international community on their nuclear program. The Obama administration came into office after a unique, tumultuous, and poorly understood U.S.-Iranian relationship during the George W. Bush administration, an administration that saw both historic engagement, unprecedented contact between high-level Iranian and high-level U.S. officials on issues of immediate concern, that being Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11, and then an unprecedented period of almost no diplomatic contact between the two sides because of an unprecedented decision by the Bush administration to abstain and to dismiss any prospects for diplomacy with Iran, obviously informed by the initial euphoria over the invasion of Iraq. The Obama administration campaign made Iran a priority in its campaign, made engagement a priority, somewhat surprisingly, even against some opposition from within his own party, within the Democratic Party, as well as, of course, opposition on the formal campaign from the other side. The change that the Obama administration promised in its policy toward Iran appears to be much more in terms of style than in substance. Gone were the references to carrot and stick diplomacy, replaced, of course, by this phrase, dual track. The first year, the Obama administration promised us engagement, and what we saw of engagement has largely been deemed a failure by the prevailing conventional wisdom here in Washington. The broad overtures that the administration launched, the Nowruz message, apparent letters that we've seen reports of from the president to his counterpart, the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in Iran, received very little in the way of a productive response. The one attempt at specific negotiations on the nuclear program and a preliminary agreement on a modest confidence-building measure that would have resulted in the refueling of the Tehran research reactor and the removal of a significant proportion of Iran's low-enriched uranium from the country, collapsed weeks after a preliminary agreement. The lack of reciprocity from the Iranian side confirmed initial skepticism within the administration about the utility of engagement. And the 2009 election turmoil within Iran and rise of the first really indigenous and legitimate opposition within Iran to the regime, I think, killed the prospects for engagement, both as a paradigm, the idea of rapprochement as a possibility with a regime that was engaged with such distasteful actions toward its own population, and I think as a tactic, largely because it became politically impossible to reach out in any really dramatic ways in the aftermath of the June 2009 elections. So quickly, about a year ago, the Obama administration began shifting, as in fact candidate Obama had signaled that he would, toward pressure, toward the coercive part of U.S. diplomacy. It took a while. It took a surprising 6 months for an administration with a considerable honeymoon in Europe and with the assistance of a reset in the relationship with Russia to obtain another UN Security Council resolution. But in fact, that resolution 1929, approved in June of this year, proved to be the most effective, surprisingly, not simply because of the terms that it contained, which include an arms embargo, a little noticed but very important provision for Iran's long-term future as a conventional military threat, but also because it served, the language within that resolution served as a platform for follow-on measures by quote-unquote like-minded states, Europeans, Australians, Japanese, and others that have begun to unveil a series of unilateral financial restrictions on Iran. All of these measures, in concert with a stepped-up effort by the U.S. Treasury to continue to close the international financial system to the Iranians, have had a real impact, as well as congressional action with a range of new unilateral and third-party sanctions and moral suasion on companies that has forced many, many companies to leave Iran. The implication at this point when you talk to US officials is that sanctions are working. We have the much vaunted leverage that we've been looking for many years. But, and of course there's always a but when Iran is concerned, it remains unclear whether the sort of economic pain, the difficulties in getting letters of credit, the difficulties that we know that traders and businessmen are experiencing in going about their day-to-day business and transactions. It's difficult to understand, to see at this stage whether or not that economic price is high enough yet to force Iran to change its nuclear calculations. It remains unclear how China will act, a key actor, unconstrained by some of the bans on energy investment that the Europeans have now adopted. And it's not clear precisely how the main factor that has impacted US policy toward Iran, Iran's internal dynamics, have been impacted by these measures to date. I'm going to speak a few words on this issue because it is the most consequential element of US policy, what happens within Iran, and it is the piece that we understand, I think, so poorly and that we have almost no ability to influence in a positive fashion. There are 3 or 4 big political earthquakes underway within Iran today. First, of course, is the splintering of the conservatives, an inevitable factor, an inevitable feature of Iranian politics, which have always been very much fragmented, have always included a considerable degree of political competition within the boundaries of the red lines of the regime. As soon as the conservatives had begun to eliminate their reformist rivals from the day-to-day political scene, they began feuding amongst themselves. It's become particularly salient because Ahmadinejad, and I use this analogy for several weeks, but it's probably more relevant today. Ahmadinejad is something like the Tea Party of Iran. He comes from a certain ideological perspective. He shares interests and cultural norms with the traditional conservatives of the Iranian regime. And yet he's radical, he's provocative, he's eclectic in his ideology, of course. This is someone who in fact embraced and advocated for women to enter soccer stadiums, for an end to some of the cultural segregation. And he's unorthodox, and as a result he unnerves even those who share many of his interests and his aims. And so this factor has complicated the Iranian internal scene, and it's complicated US diplomacy, because the conventional wisdom, of course, is that the TRR agreement concluded last fall collapsed as a result of some of the internal sniping within the regime against Ahmadinejad. The other main political factors, which I won't go into great depth, but I'm happy to talk about during the question and answer session, that I think are worth noting and are going to have a major impact on the prospects for US diplomacy, are the elimination of the left wing. As I said, the reformists are still present in very small numbers in the Iranian parliament, but they're no longer the sort of force within day-to-day politics that they have been really since the dawn of the revolution. They were the heirs to the Marxist ideology that was present at the time in the 70s, and they have transformed themselves ideologically and politically, but they've always been an important feature of Iranian politics, and at this stage they've largely been neutralized as a result of the repression that has ensued since the election turmoil last year. The other important political trends to note, I would say, are the sidelining of Rafsanjani, the political godfather of Iran, someone with a somewhat pragmatic posture who has been able to influence Iranian politics in that direction at key moments of its prior political history. And of course, the rise of the Revolutionary Guard, a trend which I think is very poorly understood at this stage, but obviously quite salient to Iran's policy. So what comes next? So far, Iran is behaving predictably. Under economic pressure, they're adopting painful economic reforms, including the change to a vast subsidy program, which has been an important feature of Iran's ability to buy off its own population. It's a very dangerous move for the regime to undertake, and it remains to be seen whether it can be done successfully without social upheaval. But if it is successful, it will blunt some of the impact of sanctions. They're also behaving predictably in the sense that they're dangling dialogue before the international community. I think the most likely outcome of the upcoming talks, if in fact they do proceed, is that there is a possibility of achieving some sort of modified version of the failed Tehran research reactor proposal that was put forward last fall that the Iranians continue to trumpet, including in their Tehran declaration signed with the Turks and the Brazilians last spring. Clearly, this is something that they want for a variety of reasons, and it's clearly something that can serve as a sort of confidence-building measure. The difficulty, of course, is that we can expect the Iranians to renege or renegotiate on any agreement that they're likely to conclude at the outset. And the difficulty beyond that is simply in trying to create the kind of momentum from what this side at least will perceive as a very modest gesture, to create momentum to really get to the crux of the nuclear issue, both enrichment and whatever other confidence-building measures can be designed that would in fact assure that the international community has sufficient transparency and clarity on the Iranian program to avoid a nuclear breakout. There's a great deal of talk these days about war in Washington, which I'd credit more to the kind of pot-stirring of journalists like Jeff Goldberg and David Broder than I think to any dialogue from either the administration or from the Israelis. It's a persistent backdrop, though, and it's a problematic one, because the more likely and more, I think, unfortunate scenario that we may see if, in fact, negotiations are not successful is an Iran that looks something like the Iraq of the 1990s, impoverished, more isolated, hollowed out, and more radicalized as a result of all of these trends. To avoid this, we need to look at the upcoming negotiations and take steps that, in fact, are likely to create the kind of positive momentum that will at least enable both sides to move forward beyond any initial agreement. Thank you.